Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. This is the third week in a row I'm uploading on a Thursday, so I'm going to give myself another hearty pat on the back, and hopefully I get a round of applause from you guys as well, because this is a new record. Like, literally, not even joking. If you go scroll through the entire library of my podcast, I can almost guarantee that there's going to be no other time that I posted on the same day of the week, even for probably 2 weeks in a row, much less like 3. I just wanted to give a warning for this podcast that I have a little baby kitten that's running around. You might hear him scream at a time or two during the podcast because sometimes he just yells when he gets really excited or if he feels like I'm not paying enough attention to him. You also might hear him running and scampering about, but I need to hang out with him because he doesn't like being left alone, and he's still integrating to my dog and my cat, so he doesn't get to hang out with them unattended. So he's just chilling here with me, and he's feeling very active right now, and he's got the zoomies. But yeah, he's very cute, and he's a fun member of the family. I've been posting more updates of him to my subscriber portals, so like Patreon or Instagram subscriptions if you're interested in that. I'm also going to start doing just more like traveling stuff too, like when I'm going on road trips or hikes and to like cool places in the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to post more behind the scenes stuff to those things as well, if that interests anyone. So it's not necessarily just going to be horse stuff. I'm just going to start doing more lifestyle stuff as well, if people find that sort of thing interesting. Because this weekend I'm going to be going on a pretty cool road trip to go see grizzly bears in Bella Coola, which is northern BC, right along the coast. And I've never been there, so I'm pretty excited about that. Anyways, this topic is one that I think is like important because it's going to be kind of about like horse personalities and then also like the logic used by people for reselling them and stuff. But like oftentimes we see a lot of posts about like whether or not you click with your horse and people selling horses because they believe that there's a personality clash and that they don't click. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that I think that a lot of the things that people like to attribute to a horse's personality oftentimes are actually a direct result of the horse reacting to management or training practices. For example, a lot of the horses who have really explosive personalities where they're like bucking, bolting, rearing, and they're otherwise difficult to handle, a lot of those traits are coming directly from inadequate management or stressful training practices or both. And if that were to be addressed, you would see them go away. So it's not actually the horse's personality. There are horses that are more high-strung in nature where they might get more nervous or stressed more easily than other horses. So you might need to take certain things into more account because they're just more easily upset than other horses. But it's a lot of things that we attribute to personality traits come from management, and even the horses who are more easily stressed and high strung, one could argue that that could be influenced by like how early they were weaned and like what their lifestyle was growing up, how much species appropriate management they get, whether or not they've been taught from a young age to have a stressful association with people. So there's a lot of different moving parts, and I think that this is why we kind of need to be careful what we label as personality traits. I'm going to use my off-the-track thoroughbred mare Harlow as an example because when I first got her, she was very stressed and very explosive. She'd try to kick and bite people for grooming. You couldn't lead her from like her turnout area to anywhere else without her like leaping in the air and just like freaking out. I would call it flying a kite because that's what it felt like. And she was just like a very stressy horse. So if I had gone and labeled that as her personality, it would have been very wrong because that was just her reacting to a stressful association with working with people and with like a lifestyle where she'd been stalled a lot at the racetrack and where people were only really handling her to groom her, to tack her, to prepare her for riding, to train for racing and stuff like that. So like her life wasn't very fulfilling. She didn't get to go out with other horses. She was very unhappy. She was riddled with ulcers and she had body discomfort, and like all of the behaviors were stemming from that. Now she's very quiet and she's a sweetheart and she's so easy to handle that like if I was giving a horse to anyone to lead who didn't know what to do with horses, she's probably the one I would pick because she's very docile and nice. But if I'd gone off of like what she was like when I initially got her, it would completely misrepresent her personality. So the topics is going to be a lot about horse personality and how like their environment influences what people perceive as personality, and then going like a little deeper to look at what what can we quantify as like actually being a personality trait in horses? So it's going to be a little bit complex, but I also wanted to talk about like the ethics of selling horses and whether or not selling horses is ethical and just the general industry perspective of that and my thoughts on that, because they've shifted quite a lot over the years. And what I find interesting about like selling horses in specific, when people are like, oh, I've like outgrown this horse, like skill wise, or like our personalities just didn't click, is like when you get a dog or a cat, like a lot of people get them as babies. So you don't really know their full personality at all because they're still developing as an individual. And you don't know what they're going to be like. But generally speaking, like you just accept them for who they are regardless, and you keep them and like you take them on as a responsibility. Horses are like one of the few animals where like you don't do that, where it's kind of expected that they adapt to your lifestyle and what you want and what your goals are, or you use that as an excuse to resell them. So like, before we go deeply into this, I want to say that I'm not like entirely anti-selling horses, but I do find that horses are often bought and sold a lot. And the reasons behind them being sold are like human incompetence and the human's lack of ability to adapt and make changes and self-reflect and look inward and see how they're contributing to the horse's behavior. And that I do have a problem with, because it results in horses just being like treated as commodities and bought and sold without thought. And it takes responsibility away from the humans to actually look at their own behavior and their own actions and how they might be contributing to a horse's behavior. Another example I have of this is that on horse groups, I often see posts about people who have just bought horses and they're like, oh, I think the old owner drugged them. They're so difficult now. They're a completely different horse, blah, 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 blah. And in some cases, that's true because horse people can be shady as fuck. So I'm not going to take away from that. However, if you buy a horse who has been like turned out in a herd on pasture and you take it and you're now putting it in a stall in a small paddock, you should absolutely be expecting a change in temperament 100%. Expecting them to be more difficult and just expecting a big behavioral change. And even if they're going into a similar lifestyle, what people need to understand is no matter how similar the overall lifestyle is, it's still a different life that the horse is now living with different people with different expectations. No matter how similarly you may ride or handle a horse to someone else, it's still going to be different, and they're going to notice differences in the amount of pressure applied, differences in your body language and your general temperament, and just different environment. And that can take time to adjust to. And they should be allowed to adjust. Like you should expect a slight behavioral change as they adjust. Sometimes it can be for the better if you're taking them into a new situation that is better equipped to meet their needs. But when we're uprooting their entire life and they're being moved away from bonds that they've potentially built with other horses and just places where they felt safe and secure, and they're going somewhere else that's now completely new, we should expect a shift in their behavior. And that shift in their behavior isn't necessarily attributable to personality. The other thing too is that a lot of the things that people attribute to personality are actually due to stress or some level of underlying discomfort or needs not being met. Like, so for example, horses who might be extremely lazy under saddle, who don't want to go forward at all, they might be uncomfortable, or they might have been dulled by training practices where they're undergoing extreme force to go forward, where they're always ridden with like a whip or spurs, and over time they've become really dulled to aids as a result. Horses who are really high strung and get stressed by very little probably have a long standing history of just being chronically stressed. So they're more easily trigger stacked and sent over threshold. And if you start to pick away at these things that are triggering them and causing stress and start to help them work through those stressors, you'll see them become less overwhelmed, and it's not going to be as stressful for them. So there's things that we think are quirks and personality traits that are actually just directly related to the handling and training of horses. And the personality that we see in horses is so influenced by like how they were brought up. A lot of horses are weaned really young and they never learn how to develop proper social skills, because from the time they're weaned, they might either be just put out with other babies who also just got weaned and who are still learning how to be a horse and don't have proper social skills, or they might even just be put into individual turnout at that point where the closest they get to other horses is with a fence line between them. And then they never learn how to properly socialize, and you can run into all sorts of problems from that. So that's not actually necessarily personality related. It's like the personality that's developed by circumstance. So with a lot of horses, that's what we're looking at. So we see similar personality traits. Like, for example, with high level sport horses or race horses, people will be like, oh, they're like this. They're high strung and difficult to handle like this because they're high level athletes. And that's just the way horses of this caliber are. I vehemently disagree with that. I think it's a complete crock of shit. And I think it's people in those environments finding a convenient excuse to explain away behavior that is shared similarities between those types of horses because of the stress that they undergo in those environments and the fact that a lot of those horses are seeing similar deprivation of needs. So, for example, race horses in North America, a lot of them when they're at the racetrack are getting no turnout. Like they get out of their stalls to go train and to go be walked and whatnot, but they're in a stall all the time otherwise, unless they're being accompanied by a human and being ridden, or they're attached to a halter and lead line. And you see a lot of similar stress behaviors where a lot of these horses have weird stall vices like cribbing or weaving, and they show like grumpy behaviors when people walk by. They may shake their heads. They may like bare their teeth and pin their ears at you and try to reach out to bite you. They might try to kick or bite you when you're brushing them, and they're going to be really explosive to handle. And people will say, oh, it's because they're a racehorse. They're a highly fit, elite athlete, and that's why they are the way that they are. But they could be as fit as they are. They could be fed the exact same diet and in the same type of training regimen. And they can be calm to handle if they actually get turned out all the time. And if they actually have access to social turnout with other horses, you could see a very different horse, even them remaining as highly fit as they are. And in fact, if they weren't stalled all the time, they'd actually probably be more fit because they'd be moving around and exercising in the field on top of the exercise that they're having from people working with them. And the same applies to like elite sport horses, like dressage horses and show jumpers. There's a lot of behaviors that people just attribute to them being an elite athlete. So they'll be like bucking and like being exuberant when they're in the competition ring, and people will be like, oh, these are just these highly fit elite athletes. Like they have to be special like this in order to be good. But it's just shared trauma that you see in these types of horses where they have very similar training practices and living situations that influence their behavior. And it's not necessarily because they're good athletes that they are like that. They are like that because of the environmental aspects, and they're good athletes despite that rather than because of it. And I would like to see this mindset shift because I think it's really damaging to the welfare of horses to have this belief system where really special, truly athletic horses who have the potential to climb the top levels and really become something in the sport world are all displaying what we know to be signs of chronic stress. And that's believed to be like a key marker of what is and isn't a good athlete, when really it's just a sign that they share similar traumas and that there's a lot of normalized care practices. Like I saw on a post about race horses, someone was saying like, oh, well, like they need to be in small paddocks because otherwise they'll run and they'll hurt themselves. And it's like, well, they run and they hurt themselves on the track too. And apparently that's, oh my God, bro, this kitten just almost broke my laptop. But they'll run and they'll hurt themselves on the racetrack. And it's like people are okay with if the injuries come from that, but it's very selfish to go, oh, it's unacceptable if they go running with their friends and they hurt themselves in the paddock, because the issue isn't really getting an injury in the first place. Because if a horse gets a sport related injury while they're competing in that sport, it's viewed as acceptable. But if it comes out of the horse doing something on their own time and living a life that's fulfilling and enjoyable to the horse, then it's viewed as a waste because the injury didn't happen in the pursuit of the human goals with the horse. And that's a huge problem. Like, I'm going to just flat out say it. There's no way around the fact that people are being selfish as fuck if they are okay with risking injury to go after their sporting goals, but they view it as too much of a risk of injury to provide a species appropriate lifestyle for the horse. And providing them with social turnout and space to move around is a species appropriate lifestyle. There's no way around it. If we measured it from the standpoint of like the standards that we hold zoos to, which I know a lot of people don't agree with zoos. And I do find that part a little ironic as like a caveat. People who have horses who keep them in like competitive barns and do the whole horse sport thing who hate zoos, because if you looked at the average boarding facility through the lens of the standards that zoos are supposed to, like good zoos are held to, a lot of the boarding barns would fail miserably because they don't have these species appropriate lifestyles. And zoos are held to a standard where they're supposed to be providing these wild, exotic animals with a species appropriate lifestyle. And while you might not agree with like them using the animals for like to have people come look at them for profit, like a lot of the ones that are actually just about rehabilitating wild animals and ensuring that they are helping maintain the integrity of endangered species and whatnot, they have people come in and pay to see these animals because they use that money to continue doing what they're doing. Whereas like boarding facilities and having horses is very much all about the people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is ironic when we have people who are keeping horses in lifestyles that are not species appropriate that then see the problem when it's like SeaWorld or a zoo, but they can't look at it within the standards of like the horse world because they're taught that these things are just like normal, responsible care for horses when that's not actually the case. So it's really interesting because there's a whole lot of cognitive dissonance. But the bottom line is that if you're willing to risk hurting your horse to go after your own sporting goals in the horse world, and that is a justifiable risk to you, but you view it as a not justifiable risk to potentially have them become injured in like a field or a paddock when they're getting more of their needs met that way, it's incredibly selfish. And unfortunately, it's so normal in the horse world that people are enabled in kind of getting away with that type of mindset. And it's viewed as totally okay because people walk on eggshells around that type of mindset. Like it's becoming less common now to do that. People are calling it out more directly, which is good. But still, people are empowered in doing things that way. And they're taught that it's fine to do because so many people do it. And because a lot of high end and expensive horses are kept that way. So it's viewed as normal. But the fact of the matter is, it's just a very selfish way of doing things because the benefits for doing horse sports largely are just about the human, because if people would provide for the horse, whether or not it was a sport horse, and if they would take care of it regardless, and the horse would have a home and a use, whether it's used for sport or not, like the act of doing the sport itself and like competing does not really give anything to the horse. If anything, people could argue it actually takes away from their well-being. So just something to consider because it's just a very interesting dynamic, and we just need to shift the way that we think of horses in general, because a lot of it comes down to the fact that people feel entitled to using them as we see fit, and we expect the horses to fit within like our cookie cutter framework of life that we provide for them, and to do so easily and without inconveniencing people, which isn't fair. But anyways, a lot of the traits that we see in horses that we attribute to personality are actually due to management. And this goes into like even the way a lot of people perceive mares and how they view mares as grumpy, bitchy, and they think that they have these traits that make them inherently more difficult. A lot of the people who have that perspective go into that looking for those traits. So if a mare, even if a mare does something that's identical to what a gelding might do, when a mare does it, they're more likely to attribute it to her gender and make her personality a gendered one. Whereas with geldings, if a gelding's difficult or whatever, they'll just be like, oh, he's just being spicy today. Or they might be more inclined to look into it and see if it's like a pain response. Whereas mares don't typically get the same luxury of that because they're just expected to be a certain way because they're female. And you see it with like chestnuts as well, like the whole chestnut mare stereotype where they're viewed as more fiery and difficult. But I think that it's, if you look at stuff from that mindset and you're going into it through that lens already, you're going to explain their behavior based off of the fact that they're a chestnut mare, rather than looking a little bit deeper and going like, is there something going on under the surface? Is she in pain or whatever? And the interesting thing is like with Milo, like I posted some videos where like he's more introverted and doesn't really like other horses that aren't in his herd all that much. So sometimes when he's walking by new horses, he just has his ears pinned and he's ignoring them, but he's like, I actually hate you. And anytime I posted something like that, people are like, oh, LOL, it's a chestnut mare. And they just assume right away because of his behavior that he's female. And I find that interesting because it just shows how deeply rooted these mindsets are. Like, or like honestly, any video where you show a horse showing like any type of behavior that could be perceived as grumpy or cranky, people will be like, oh, LOL, classic mare. And that's not actually true. Like my mares are like often like Harlow is way more adaptable and nice to other horses and gets along with everyone than in comparison to Milo. And that's just the way they are. Like Milo's a much more introverted horse and doesn't really like, he has his friends that he likes and he doesn't really have interest in other horses until they kind of give him a reason to. Like with some horses, maybe he's getting better as he's gotten older and he's lived in a more diverse herd, but it's just not his thing. And it has nothing to do with the fact that he's a gelding versus a mare. And like with mares, they tend to be more honest in their communication because you have to consider it too from like a species specific standpoint. Mares are in a natural setting are the ones that are having babies and who are going to be teaching them how to be horses. So they need to be very adept and clear in their communication. So they're more likely to show how they are feeling. I find that geldings naturally may have less ability to do that and have the same clarity of mares. And also since it's like an expectation from the part of humans, like they might learn over time that when they do try to communicate that it just gets ignored. And mares might be less likely to go down without a fight when it comes to that. They're going to keep trying to communicate because it's instilled in them because of their spot in like a natural herd setting. And like horses as a species, like despite the fact that we've domesticated them, they've not changed as much as like a species like dogs have. Like they're still very, very closely aligned with the wild counterparts and like the natural species specific behaviors that you would see in wild horses. So like what I would encourage people to do is like to sway away from stereotypes. And also if you feel like you're not clicking with a horse, like ask yourself why specifically, like what behaviors is the horse showing that are making you feel like you don't click and you don't understand? Because a lot of times when people feel like they don't click, it's because they don't understand why their horse is doing something. They don't understand how to fix it. And also generally speaking, it's because they find the behaviors themselves frustrating and they would prefer to not have to deal with them, which I get things can be frustrating, but also when you decide to take on an animal, you should be taking on the responsibility of trying to work through issues that they have to a certain extent. And like, it's definitely different if you get a horse where you're like really just not experienced enough to deal with whatever it is going on. And like you were lied to by the seller or whatever, and you're recognizing that you've bit off more than you can chew and that you need help. And if you can't afford to hire that help, that's totally valid. So this isn't to say that like you should just tough it out in all settings, but I do think that people should look deeper at like what they're actually classifying as not clicking with a horse and what behaviors specifically they do not like. And then from there, look at ways that that could be fixed. Like, is it management related? Is there something in the horse's day-to-day lifestyle that could be heavily influencing their behavior? And if so, what can you do to improve that? Is it skill related on your part? Are you just not sure how to fix something? Is your trainer not being particularly supportive? Like all behavior has an underlying motivation. So if you actually just look at the behavior and go, what behaviors are making me feel like I'm not connecting with this horse and why? And also like look at what are you doing to actually connect with them? Are you only doing the things that you want to do? Are you only riding them and trying to do things that the horse might not actually like doing, but that you really want to do? Are you only chasing your own personal goals when it comes to showing and use of the horse? Like when people talk about not clicking with their horse, it's like, what are you doing that is mutually enjoyable for you and your horse? Because if you're only doing the stuff that you want to do, how can you expect to click and connect with an animal when you're never doing things that they like? And I think that's also a huge part of the problem. Like to actually get to know the horse, people need to spend more time watching the horse in their turnout and in their natural setting. And like when they're actually getting to do what they want, they need to spend more time doing things like going for little hand walks and letting the horse hand graze. They need to do things like grooming the horse if the horse likes being brushed. And if they don't, figuring out why they don't like being brushed in certain areas. Do they have ulcers? Are they in pain? Can you find an area that they do enjoy being brushed in? And like making it more about actually trying to find stuff that is mutually enjoyable for yourself and the horse. And also, even if it's not enjoyable for you initially, finding stuff that's more enjoyable for the horse and manageable for the horse. Because if you're truly looking to make a connection, it can't just be all about you all the time. And what I find with a lot of riders, and I speak from experience because I used to do the same things myself too, is that they're fixated on just chasing their own personal goals and desires with the horse. And they're a lot less interested in doing stuff that the horse likes. Like they want the horse just to like what they like and what they want to do just because. But they give very little incentive for the horse to like those things. And there's very little time put into just spending mutually enjoyable time with the horse. And if more people would do that, they'd probably find that their horse looks forward to seeing them more often, that they might become easier to catch, and that they become easier to deal with overall, just because they have this history of stuff actually being fun with the person. But if they're always just doing stuff that you like and that they don't, then they're going to look at you and they're going to go, oh no, here she comes again. I hate hanging out with this chick because she's no fun. It's always just all about her and I don't like it. And what I encourage people to look at it like through the lens of like, if you had a friend who every time you hung out with them, they only ever did stuff that they wanted to do and they did it knowing that you did not like doing those things, it wouldn't take you very long to decide that you no longer want to hang out with that friend. And that's because you actually have the autonomy to make that choice and go, you know what? I'm going to say no today. I don't feel like hanging out with them. Whereas horses can't do that, because if they try to say no, it's like, oh, Bob is being hard to catch today. Let me just chase him around the field and teach him a lesson. Like, they get harassed and punished when they try to say no to things and try to exercise their autonomy. It's not allowed because they largely do not have a choice. So if we're not going to give them that choice, then we need to really make sure we're trying to do things that they enjoy. And also, like, if they do say no, I would encourage people to look at, why is your horse saying no? Because if they found being around you truly enriching and enjoyable, they would make the choice to spend more time with you more often. And so, like, if a horse doesn't want to hang out with you, that is, as much as it sucks, it's a form of communication that's very telling about how the horse associates with you and your presence and whether or not they enjoy hanging out with you. So taking that as communication and recognizing the fact that even if it's communication that you don't like and that you would prefer not to see, it's communication nonetheless, and it's something that you do need to listen to, because it'll give you valuable information about your horse and how you can make changes to hopefully alter that perspective. But the biggest thing is, if we're looking to connect with horses, there needs to be some mutual like attempts on our part to sacrifice doing what we want to just make things more enjoyable for the horse and actually provide incentive for them to want to be around us. And I've talked about this in other podcasts as well, but like, if the only thing that they get out of work is like relief from some level of discomfort, no matter how minor, there's very little incentive for them to like it. So this is why I encourage some level of rewards-based training, or doing stuff that the horse is at least neutral towards or finds interesting, and just like breaking things up so that it's not just like ride, hard work, hard labor, stuff that the horse doesn't like to do. Start to incorporate things that you know that they like to do. Don't make every time you take them out of their turnout all about riding and hard work, because they're going to start to associate you with things that they don't actually like to do. So if you find yourself not clicking with your horse, my best advice is to find something that you find mutually enjoyable and that you know that the horse likes, and start to do that a little bit more and give them more breaks away from stuff that they don't like as much, and start to do stuff that they like a little bit more, and find more balance so that you're not just making it all about you, especially if it's like a newer relationship with this horse. When you're trying to earn their trust, you need to prove that you're a trustworthy person that they can enjoy being around and feel safe around. And you can't do that by just immediately going to doing what you want to do with the horse, regardless of how they feel about it. You need to take into account how they feel, whether or not they feel comfortable around you and safe around you. And if they don't, then you need to show them that they can. And that can take time. And it'll take even longer with horses who's never had that type of relationship with people. If they've learned that people just do whatever they want to them, regardless of what the horse wants to do, and that they just have to go along with it, they are going to take longer to convince that they can trust you and feel safe around you. It'll take more time and repetition. Sometimes we're talking months or years. It really depends. So this is something to consider when you're going into getting a horse, especially if you get a horse who's had a more erratic lifestyle where they've moved from home to home. And like, this is the case with a lot of race horses. And race horses are a pretty popular choice. Off the track thoroughbreds are a pretty popular choice because they're cheap athletes and they can be retrained for a lot of disciplines. So a lot of people like getting them, but they have generally been claimed and bought and sold. So they've been through a lot of different homes. They've had to adapt a lot and be moved around a lot. So their lives are not super stable, and they haven't really had a static lifestyle where they can learn to trust things, right? So they might take more time to be convinced that they can be safe around you than a horse who's had like one owner and that you're buying directly from the breeder who's had like a really safe, secure life where they've had like a slow weaning and they've learned that life feels inherently safe. Horses who have been living in a state where they don't feel safe very often are going to be harder to earn the trust of, and it's going to take more time and planning on your part. So when you find yourself in a situation where you feel like your horse doesn't really like you and that you're not connecting and that they don't enjoy their time around you, try to find little, like even if it's short amounts, even if you're only getting 2 or 5 minutes at a time where they're actually enjoying being around you, try to find little things that they like to do. And this is also why rewards-based training is so great. Like, shameless plug, I know, because most horses like food. And even if they're not sure how to take treats initially, usually you can find something that they'll like. If they won't try treats and they don't eat grain, you can do stuff like hay chaff and buy like alfalfa chaff, which is just chopped hay, or even like a bale of like higher end, like fancier hay. Like if they get like regular just grass hay, getting like an alfalfa and feeding them the really leafy bits, that they'll like that. You can make pretty much anything fun if you have food and if you keep it easy for the horse to get the right answer for, and just do slow. So even if it's only 2 to 5 minutes at a time where you're getting like a truly enjoyable session where the horse is actually choosing to be around you. This is also why liberty work is so great, because it'll give you a really clear sign if the horse actually likes you and wants to be around you. And also, this is just to say that they might choose to not hang out with you, and it doesn't mean that they dislike you. It just might be like they aren't feeling it right now. But liberty work gives you a really clear signs of like whether or not the horse wants to participate, because they learn that they can just walk away. And it's also a great way to show them that they have autonomy and that there's not going to be like a penalty for if they do walk away. And this can be a great way to learn how to connect with your horse, because you see what they like, what they dislike, what they find difficult, what they find really easy, and what they want to participate in. And you can also do this even within the comfort of like their own field. Like you don't even need to take them into an arena. You can hang out with them in their field and just like spend time with them out there and see what they like, and see like if they start to follow you more, to want to be around your presence and just hang out near you. These are all very good signs. But the fact of the matter is, if you feel like you're not connecting with a horse, start out by getting like a clear idea of what behaviors specifically they are displaying that make you feel like you aren't clicking with them. Like, what are they specifically doing that's making you feel disconnected, and what behaviors do you not like? And then the next thing would be, what activities can you find that the horse likes that you can do with them, and can you incorporate more of those activities? And oftentimes, if you have a horse who's not enjoying spending time with you, it's going to involve cutting things right back to the basics and foregoing instant gratification and not being able to ride them and do the things that you might have been wanting to do right away if they're not liking that and if it's not going well. The other thing, of course, is to make sure that there isn't like physical pain going on, and to like look at their management and see whether their needs are fulfilled in those ways, because you can get a very different horse if you make changes to their overall level of comfort and you also ensure that they're getting their species appropriate needs met. So now let's get into talking about selling horses and the ethics involved. And I'm just going to be fully upfront and say that like a lot of the ways that we see horses being bought and sold right now aren't particularly ethical, because it's way too normalized to just like up and sell them, and people don't really like fully level with like how disruptful that is to the horse's life and how stressful that can be. And like we're not taught to be conscious enough of that and just like considerate of like how they're leaving their homes, how they might be leaving their friends, how often horses are taken away from their friends without thought. And we do need to be more considerate of that. Oh my goodness, little guy. Okay. But yeah, we aren't considerate enough of the effect that it has on horses to take them away from their friends and to uproot their lives in that way. And like, even if we were just more considerate of that and the impact it has on them psychologically, that would make selling more ethical. But a lot of people don't even really consider those things, or consider how often horses are leaving and going to new homes, because there's a stat, and I'm not completely sure where it comes from, so I can't really attest to like the validity of it, but there's a stat that's like the average horse goes through about 7 homes in their lifetime. And to me, honestly, that seems low, because I would imagine for some horses it's way, way higher than that. But the fact of the matter is, it's like exceptionally uncommon for a horse to actually live in the same home for their entire life. That's very uncommon. And like that horse has hit the freaking jackpot if they're in a good home for the entirety of their life. So they're bought and sold frequently, oftentimes without thought and without consideration of how it's going to impact their well-being to be leaving their friends. And then when they're out of sorts in their new home, people aren't fully taking into account like, hey, maybe this horse is really missing their friends and they're stressed because they're having to adjust to like this new lifestyle, and maybe that's really hard for them. So selling could be more ethical if we were actually looking at the impacts to the horse and how they are feeling personally in those moments. But also we need to be less about like buying and selling horses and like getting rid of them if you don't click with them right away, or being like, I've outgrown this horse's skill level. And like a lot of times it's because the horse isn't sound to compete higher, and like getting rid of lame horses, old horses, etc. It's like as soon as they no longer serve your purpose, people pawn them off onto someone else. And there's a lot of situations like what I talked about in my last podcast about like a good death. There's a lot of situations where people are just trying to pawn off lame or geriatrically old horse onto someone else because they don't want to have to do the end of life care where they're basically just caring for the horse until they die, where they're like retired and they can't use them. And this concept actually kind of plays into a lot of it, where people aren't interested in having horses that they cannot ride at all, or that they cannot ride at the level that they would like to. And the problem with this is that this is behind a lot of people not being able to click with a horse, because you're not going to click with a horse that can't do the things that you want to do. People are far too focused on what horses can do for them rather than actually building a relationship with the horse. It's way too much about riding. And again, this is not an attack on any specific people, because I used to do this too. And it's something that we're largely just indoctrinated into when we start out our riding careers. And it's really bad because it creates a certain level of disconnect with the horse, where people think that you connect with horses through riding when that's not really the case. Like a horse is going to feel most connected with the person probably through groundwork and just like chilling with them and doing stuff that they actually like. Like horses don't connect with each other through riding. Riding's a very unnatural thing. It's just something that people like to do, but we've been taught that that's like the best way to connect with a horse. But like if that's all you're doing with the horse, you don't really actually know them all that well. So there's this hyper fixation on riding and moving up the levels and doing what you want riding wise. And when the horse can no longer do that with you, to just get a new one and get rid of them. And there's this mindset where it's like, oh, well, I can't keep a horse that I can't ride. And that's inherently problematic, because then all of these unrideable horses essentially have no value. And yes, there's some people who are very nice who are willing to take on those horses and take care of them even when they can't ride them, but there's not enough of those homes. And I talked about this is going to get a little redundant because I talked about it in the Good Death episode. But like this obsession with riding is directly tied to a lack of ethics involved in selling. And also just the marketing language used to sell horses is inherently problematic at times, where people will be like, oh, this horse is like a kick ride. You can do whatever you want to them. They're bomb proof. And like just the idea of normalizing the word kick ride. Like I get what people are getting at. Like they're not hyper responsive, you have to use more leg, and I get it, but the idea of just normalizing like a certain level of violence, like a whip and a kick ride, in order to get a horse going when some of those horses might be backed off because they're uncomfortable. Also, like quirky is often used to describe horses who have like behavioral issues under saddle, and like the language used for horses, some of it comes off as like car salesman-esque, and it is dehumanizing is the wrong word because they're obviously not humans, but it's like degrading horses to the level of being like machinery, and we kind of buy and sell them as such. So I don't think selling is inherently unethical at all times, because I think that there's benefit to doing stuff like where it's like trainers take on young horses and they get them going and they teach them necessary skills that a lot of people aren't equipped to deal with, and that they don't want to put that work in. So you get professionals to do that, and they find them long-term homes, ideally. But so there's like a time and place for selling where that's like a good thing, because it's like, yes, not everyone can bring a horse along to the levels that they might be wanting to ride at, and that is important. but there's a certain mindset involved where horses are just treated as commodities and are bought and sold willy-nilly. And I don't know, I said that backwards. And we aren't actually considering what it is we're doing. So, like, for me, I've kind of taken a big step back from doing sales projects because it made me feel bad, like having to uproot their lives and take them away from these friends that they've built, even if they're going to a good home. And it's harder to do a sales project and actually make money off of it because, like, that's the purpose of it. If it's your job, you do need to make money. Otherwise, you're just losing money. But the amount of time involved where you have to keep the horse and, like, actually get them to the point where you can be comfortable selling them, and then also finding a home that's suitable for them that actually can pay what you're asking, can be hard because sometimes, like, the mid-range home where you would be making less money over the time you've had the horse, sometimes that's oftentimes the best home because they're the homes that are just looking for, like, a pet and, like, a horse to just have around and grow old with. And the difficult thing with that is that, like, to make good money, like, if you're producing, like, a show horse, oftentimes the people who are really invested in buying, like, a nice show horse are the same types of people who will be selling that horse when it no longer serves their purposes and they've, like, outgrown the level that the horse is capable of doing. And then they're sold mostly for, like, their skill set to be, like, a vehicle for someone in the show ring and less about, like, who they are as a creature. And that can be a huge problem. So I've taken a step back from that because it's hard to produce a horse fast enough ethically to make the money that you could selling them as a mid-range horse. And also, if you're prioritizing selling them as a show horse, that's where the most money is typically at, but that's also where they're the most likely to be sold and, like, leased out and just, like, becoming, like, a product. So that part's difficult. Like, I got my Mustang Mesa as, like, a sales project, but she's, like, a very, very, very introverted horse who takes a long time to trust people. And, like, I can't in good faith sell her to someone right now. And also, like, even when I do eventually sell her, she's not going to be the type of horse that's going to be, like, a show horse. Like, I think that would be the worst thing ever to happen to her, is to go somewhere where someone wants to sell her. Like, she wants to be someone's farm pet and, like, a trail horse who is just, like, a one-person ridden horse. Like, that's where she would be the best off. And that's a pretty niche lifestyle that, like, I know I'm not going to be making any money off of her if I ever sell her. So I've learned that it's just, like, not a good business to be in if you want to do it ethically, because when you're producing horses quickly and you're kind of rushing through the levels of training and you're not feeling as bad about that, you can make the most money that way. And when I started out, like, I was in the process of doing things more ethically and I was still learning, but there was still a lot of stuff that was rushed in order to make the horses marketable quickly. And I just don't feel good about doing that anymore because, like, the more I've thought about it, it's just like I feel bad for them for, like, how their life is being uprooted, like, even if they do find good homes. And I mean, the ones that I have sold, I know where they are, and, like, I cared about where they go and, like, all of that jazz. But for, like, the amount of money you're making or, like, what you're losing, it's just not worth it anymore. And there's so much risk involved because even if the person you sell the horse to is great, they could always resell the horse to someone who they think is great, who ends up not being so great. And even if you vet homes and stuff, they can always just not end up being quite what you think. So it's a hard thing to be. And, like, I've kind of gotten to the point where it's like I don't really want to sell horses anymore. Like, if I did rescue and, like, behavioral rehabs and was, like, a not-for-profit where I could outsource some of the funds, that would be a little bit different. But honestly, like, I just find that like, buying and selling horses is an inherently risky endeavor, and it's something where I'm not as comfortable doing it as I once was. Maybe one day when I get, like, my own property and I have more resources available to really do things slowly and just, like, have horses out on large plots of land and be, like, cutting my own hay and doing stuff like that. Maybe one day when all that stuff is happening, it'll be more doable. But for now, it's something where it's like, yeah, I have ethical dilemmas when it comes to selling horses. Like, it doesn't have to be an inherently unethical thing with the way that the horse world functions right now, where it's so profit driven and where it's so fixated on riding horses and what they can do for you under saddle specifically. It's a problem because as soon as, like, a horse goes lame or has, like, a career ending injury, then you have this big problem where no one wants them anymore. And Like, I would take horses back if that happened, but to be quite honest, it'd be a situation where they would probably be having to get euthanized, and it would be like giving them a good death if they're not marketable to any other person, because like I already have too many horses because I've ended up keeping some. And that's not really a situation I want to be in, but it's like the reality of like the way the horse world functions right now, just because horses lose so much value when they're not being ridden. Like, even just like I'm not even talking monetary value. I'm talking about like emotional value and like whether or not people want to like keep them. And so yeah, there's a lot of ethical dilemmas when it comes to buying and selling horses, and we've just been taught to view things through such a skewed lens. Like, I think the entire concept of like not clicking with a horse is largely manufactured by the mindset that justifies like flippantly buying and selling horses without a care in the world. There's this belief that they should click with us right away, and that if you have the right horse that you'll just know right away, and that like there's nothing you have to do. But like, no, you should always be changing and improving regardless of the horses you have around. And sometimes the horses who are the most difficult and who request that you reflect and change things the most, sometimes those are the horses who are going to teach you the most. And I'd say like oftentimes that's the case. So whenever you feel like you don't click with a horse or you don't really like them, I find that that's like a sign to kind of get to the bottom of why that is. Because usually it's something the horse is doing behaviorally that's making your day harder and that you don't like dealing with. And if you start to reflect on why that is and get curious about why they're displaying that behavior, it equips you with the skills to actually potentially fix it, or at least develop a little bit more compassion with why they're struggling. Because don't get me wrong, when I'm dealing with horses who are dangerous and who are giving me grief because of their behavior, it's very frustrating and I don't enjoy it, especially when you can't fix what you think the causes of that behavior are because they're not your horse or you're limited or whatever. I don't enjoy it and I dislike working with those horses. But by changing my perspective about how I see those things, I've been able to at least operate with more compassion and understanding, which helps me temper any frustration that I do have. And that's been a very useful skill in the long run, even if I might not still like working with those horses. Like, don't get me wrong, when horses are difficult and they're actively endangering me, I'm generally not having a good time. The most rewarding part of it is when you make big changes to their behavior and you can feel really good about that. And that feels great. But sometimes you have to wait months or years to really reap those benefits and see a big difference. And sometimes with like client horses specifically, you might not even see the changes because if the client's not ready to make the needed changes, or if it takes time to get to the bottom, you don't always see them. So sometimes it can be very disheartening, because my kitten's trying to walk across my keyboard. But no, sometimes it can be very disheartening to just have to deal with them and kind of cope with the behavior and mitigate it where you can. And this is especially true for like barn workers and people who have to just handle these horses but aren't involved in the training of them. And that's where it can be exceptionally frustrating and you can feel really trapped. But yeah, this is a good skill for those types of people too, where it's like just try to operate from a place of compassion when a horse is being really difficult. Because like the thing is, they don't really want to be difficult. Like, they're not animals that choose violence and chaos as like their go-to thing. Like, they're not like this kitten here who wants to climb all over my keyboard and like tear down the curtains and like climb up my leg when I'm standing up. They just want to coexist and like live their lives. So when they're choosing to actively be difficult, especially in situations where it's like you're using things like nose chains or lip chains, or they're getting in trouble and they're going to get punished for it, like they don't want to be punished. So if they're doing behaviors that oftentimes result in that, despite knowing that history, there's something that's going on under the surface that you should just be considerate of. And the more you try to work towards understanding why they're doing something and where the behavior is coming from, and operate from that place of compassion, the more able you are going to be, not able only to like resolve these issues, or at least make them better within the capacity that you have available to you, but you'll also just hopefully end up liking the horse a little bit more and coming from a place of compassion and understanding rather than one of frustration and anger and misunderstanding. Because All behavior is communication. And you can't effectively click with a horse who is not clicking with life in general because they are miserable. So in a lot of cases, when people are meeting extreme resistance from the horses they're working with, there's something going on under the surface that needs to get addressed. And if you have the curiosity and the patience to start addressing that, you might find that you end up having this incredible relationship with a horse because it's one that has been comprised of a desire to understand them more deeply and to help them. And that's how you really connect with anyone, isn't it? Just to get to understand them more deeply. No matter whether it's a human or an animal, if you make the effort to try to understand where they are coming from and why they're behaving the way that they are, and do so with compassion and caring and understanding, then you're going to be operating from a place where you're actually getting to know them as an individual and trying to help them out and help them navigate life better. And it can create a much deeper connection and bond. And this is what's been so amazing with like my horse Milo and getting to know him as an individual and like over the years, because initially like I resisted it a lot more. So I wasn't getting to know him in the way that I am now. But over the years, I've become more compassionate and understanding towards him as I've learned more and have been able to look at his behavior at face value and just get curious about it. And it's led to a much more understanding relationship where even when he is highly stressed and he's not having a good time, he's more likely to just allow me to do things that need to be done, or at least come down from his panic attack and be more manageable to handle, because we've developed this history of understanding where he knows he can feel safe around me and where I'm making an effort to try to understand him. And for a lot of these horses that are so loud in their behavior and difficult, they scream and they shout because their whispers aren't heard. And if you make more of an effort to try to understand why they're doing something and your actions reflect that to them, where they're like, this person's trying to help me, then you start to see that behavior quiet down and they become much more manageable, typically speaking. But all behavior is communication. So at the end of the day, it's like every time someone says they don't click with a horse or that they don't like a horse and they don't get along, there's behaviors that have led them to feeling that way. So if you ask yourself what those behaviors in specific are and why they might exist, then you are operating with a solution-oriented mindset. And this isn't to say that people should just like endanger themselves. Like if you have a horse that is putting you in danger and you feel like you're very much not equipped to deal with it, but you can't afford a trainer to help you, that's a difficult situation to be in. I'm not encouraging people to put themselves in a situation where they're going to kill themselves or get severely injured, but it's just an encouragement to be more patient. Like you don't need to be in the show ring within a year of getting a new horse. I know you can want to, and people at your barn and your trainer might also want that. And you could feel pressured by them, but you don't need to do that. So you could take a step back and you could step away from the people who are rushing you and putting you in an uncomfortable position and encouraging you to rush. And you could take your time and just see what happens and maybe become closer aligned with people who are in agreement with that mindset and who will help you. Like if you find you're with a trainer or you're at a barn where you're feeling very pressured and it's stressing you out and it's putting ideas in your head about your horse that you're not comfortable with, then that might be a sign to find like a different community to align yourself with. But the fact of the matter is, like, a lot of the stuff that we create that makes us feel rushed with horses is not as much of a rush as you think it is, especially anything specific to riding. There's like, you don't need to ride. You could spend a year, even 2 years, even 3 years, even 4 or 5 or 10 doing groundwork, and your horse is not going to suffer because of it. And honestly, learning how to have the patience to do that and learning how to enjoy groundwork and stuff outside of riding is like a super valuable skill as well that will serve you really well in the future. So anytime you feel like you aren't clicking, just like look deeper, ask yourself why. And like no matter what, there's going to be animals that you connect on a deeper level with more so than others, in the same way with people. But like animals are very honest little beings and they're different from people in that regard, where you can find common ground with them a lot easier in most cases. And so when there's a lack of connection or understanding, if you look a little deeper, you'll probably find it. So that's just my thoughts on the matter. Selling horses doesn't have to be unethical, but it can't really become more ethical than it is until we change like our perception of the horse rider relationship in general and just make more of an effort to operate at a level of understanding that's more considerate of the horse. And that is more centered around trying to actually have it be a conversation rather than a situation where the horse needs to defer to the person at all times. And I think I'm all talked out now, but like if anyone has any ideas for future podcast episodes, please do send them to me or comment them on the podcast and I'll check them out at some point. But it's really helpful because it gives me inspiration. And I just wanted to get this one up before I go away for the weekend and and give a little kitty cat update. I'm going to post about them more on my subscriber pages and then I'll do like an intro video, like a little intro video on YouTube at some point and give people a little bit of an update. So yeah, check all of that out. And I'm going to be posting more on YouTube coming up because I've been trying to film a lot. It's just the editing that has been hard for me to get on board with because life has just been so hectic. So if you check out the links down below and check out my YouTube and stuff and subscribe there and turn on post notifications, it'd be much appreciated. Anyone who likes and comments on those videos too, it's super helpful because like the algorithm has kind of screwed me over the last few years since my account got hacked. So getting it up and running again is pretty much reliant on having like genuine comments and people liking and sharing the videos and stuff. So when people do that, it's like hugely appreciated. And yeah, I'm going to be trying to do like more lifestyle content too, to just incorporate other things into my podcasts and like my general postings as well, because I think that we don't necessarily recognize how much of our lives outside of horses actually influence our entire perspectives of horses. And the shift that I've seen in my horsemanship and just like my perception of horse behavior has helped me out in so many other ways in my own personal life because it's just shifted the way I see so many things, including how I see people and whatnot. So I think talking about like that whole connection is important and it might help people come to terms with like where their head is at quicker because it really did for me and it took me a while to make those connections. There's just been this big shift that I've been having lately and I'm still in the middle of it, but we're getting to like a more complete perspective as well. But we're always learning and growing. And I think that's another way to look at it too, is like with horses, you're always learning and growing. No matter how long you've done something a certain way, there might be a better way to do it that comes along years and years down the road. And you just got to be open-minded enough to consider exploring that and be okay with being new to something because it's a scary jump to make, but you have so much to gain if you alter your perspectives and just start to look at things a different way. So it's totally worth it. But yeah, if you find yourself struggling to connect with the horse, look deeper and ask yourself whether or not you are doing things that the horse likes and doing things that'll help them feel more connected with you. Because that's our job to do that. Since we're like the investigators, the trainers, and the troubleshooters in the relationship, it requires more work on our part to make things work. And sometimes a lot of that resistance is related to people not wanting to do that. So just some food for thought. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.